Yeah, so, well, thank you very much, Paul. When I thought about this book, I mean, who else can talk about this book better than Professor Goodwin, who is the writer of the book? So it's a really a great pleasure to have you here, and thank you very much for contributing to this initiative. So it's over to you, Paul.
Right. Well, thank you very much for organising this session, Barman. And again, thank you very much for inviting me to talk about my book, which, as everybody will know now, is called Profit from Your Forecasting Software. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background and why I wrote the book to start with, and then I'm going to draw some of the concepts that the first two chapters cover. Because these are the introductory chapters, there will be an omnibus of different topics here. One or two may be rather elementary for those of people who have an advanced knowledge of forecasting, but hopefully there'll be something of interest for everybody in what I've got to say. So why did I write the book? Well, many sales forecasters in companies find themselves in a job for which they've received no training. Often the person happens to be in the coffee bar at the wrong time on a Friday afternoon, and the boss comes in and says, the previous forecaster has just resigned, you're our forecaster from next Monday. And these poor people are faced with the daunting job of forecasting, and they've received no training in the topic at all. As a result, people often resort to basing forecasts on judgment. They stick their fingers in the air and use guesstimates about future sales or demand, when statistical forecasting methods would actually be more accurate. But because they have no knowledge of these, they tend to resort to judgment. Alternatively, they find themselves using forecasting software with little understanding of the methods or algorithms that the software embodies. I remember several years ago doing a course for British Telecom, and I was asked to teach simple exponential smoothing. And I was very worried. I thought, these will be expert forecasters. They won't learn anything from me. But after the session, they said, oh, we're delighted with this. We've been using exponential smoothing for years, and we always wondered what it was. So this book is intended to help people like these to make the best use of available commercial forecasting software, allowing them to understand how the methods work and how to operate the software. So the tone of the book is non-mathematical. Most forecasters in companies aren't statisticians or mathematicians. So it's non-mathematical. You won't find a sigma sign, I'm afraid, in the book. It's evaluative. It documents the strengths and limitations of different forecasting methods and accuracy measures. It's restricted to methods found in common commercial software. So things like artificial intelligence and so on aren't covered, because most commercial software widely used in companies is yet to embody those methods. The book is also advisory. For example, it advises you when judgmental overrides to the software's forecasts are likely to be beneficial. For example, you may know about a special event coming along that the forecasting software doesn't know about, and you may feel you're justified in overriding the forecasts. So the book tells you when it's advisable to do that. It also tells you when you should allow software to choose a forecasting method. Should you choose a method yourself, or should you allow the software automatically to choose it? The book offers guidance on this. And hopefully the book is practical. There's an emphasis on applying methods embodied in software. So there's very little theory, very little on the theory that underpins these methods. So that's the sort of general background to the book. Let's talk about why forecasting is important in demand and sales forecasting. Well, in many companies, accurate sales or demand forecasts can be crucial. Lots of different decisions can depend on them. Decisions relating to inventory planning, deciding how much stock to hold or when to order new stock, all dependent on forecasting. Logistic planning, planning deliveries and transportation of your materials, all of that can depend on accurate forecasts. Production scheduling, purchasing decisions, deciding when to purchase raw materials or packaging. And of course, human resource planning, deciding how many staff you need to employ, how many people you need to be operating in the factory or the workshop at any given time. All of this is dependent upon accurate forecasting. One estimate is that avoidable forecast errors add between 2 and 4% to production costs. So we can never achieve perfect forecasts, as we'll see later, but some errors are avoidable. And if you don't avoid those, it can add an awful lot to your production costs. Another estimate is that a company with $1 billion turnover, sorry, $1 billion turnover, could make savings of between $5 and $10 million by using accurate forecasts to reduce inventory levels. Yet in one survey, 40% of respondents admitted they were not leveraging the advantages of statistical modeling in their demand planning operations. So accurate forecasts offer real opportunities for improving efficiency and reducing costs. Yet often their benefits are not drawn upon by people making forecasts. This is the first talk in this series, so perhaps we should ask ourselves, what is a forecast? It may seem like an elementary question, but problems can arise in companies because of confusion of what a forecast is. As we'll see, forecasts are often regarded in many different ways by those using them. So I'm going to stick my neck out and give this definition of a forecast. I'm going to say a forecast is an honest statement of what we can expect to happen at a future date based on the information we have available at the time the forecast was made. Emphasis on the word honest there, as we'll see, many forecasts are not honest statements. So what is a forecast not? Well, a forecast isn't what we hope will happen. I might hope to sell an extra 2 million units of my product next month, but that's not the same as a forecast. It's not what I actually think will happen. A forecast isn't a target. Often targets are designed to make people increase their efforts. I know of people working in companies where the targets are impossible to achieve, but they're there to try and get people to strive to get as close as possible to what the target figure is. But a target isn't, again, the same as what you genuinely think will happen. A forecast is not what we would intend to happen if we could control future events. For example, it's not a plan. If I could control future events, I would hope to sell 2,000 units a month, but I can't control those events. I realize there is uncertainty and a lack of control. So a forecast isn't what we intend to happen. It's not a plan. A forecast isn't a number that will please the boss or give us a political advantage. Many companies, there's evidence that people are worried about forecasting lower sales than the boss would expect. So they inflate the forecast to keep the boss happy. In other companies, people often inflate their forecasts so that their department will attract more funding. Again, these are not honest statements of what we think is going to happen in the future. And finally, a forecast differs from a decision. For example, deciding how much stock to hold is not the same as a forecast of what demand will be. For example, I may expect sales of 5,000 units next month, but I might decide to hold 6,000 units in case demand is higher than expected. It's a decision of mine to hold 6,000 units in stock, but the forecast is 5,000. We often stock more than we expect to sell to guard against stockouts. For example, pharmaceutical companies can't afford to run out of drugs for vital illnesses, so they often stock more than they expect to actually require. So a decision and a forecast are different, but in many companies these things are confused, and that can create obvious problems. Again, this may be elementary if you're an expert on forecasting, but it's worth, I think, at this early stage to summarize these concepts. And I want to briefly talk about 3 different ways of presenting forecasts. I think ideally all forecasts would be density forecasts. they would show you the probabilities of all possible outcomes in the future occurring. And here we see a density forecast for next month's demand for a product, number of units sold. And we can see the most likely level of demand is around 240 units. Looks very unlikely that demand will exceed 320 units, or that it will fall below, say, 150 units. So a density forecast gives you the probabilities of all the different possible outcomes that you can envisage occurring, and it shows you that some outcomes are more likely than others. But more often than not, we use what I call abbreviated forecasts. And next down in the list is a prediction interval. For example, a 90% prediction interval might run from about 150 units to about 310 units. And what this means is there's a 90% chance that the interval will capture the actual demand. Think of the prediction interval as a net trying to catch what the actual demand will be. So a 90% prediction interval would give us a 90% chance of capturing the actual demand. But of course, a prediction interval doesn't tell you what happens outside the interval and so on. And it doesn't tell us that the most likely level of demand is in the middle at 240 units necessarily. The most common forecasts we encounter are a further abbreviation, and they're simply point forecasts. In this case, our point forecast would be 240 units. Now, forecasting in practice is dominated by point forecasts, but these provide no information on how much uncertainty are associated with future demand. We don't know how high demand might be, or how low it might fall, or how likely it is to fall below the point forecast or above it. So we can't, for example, use point forecast to determine safety stock levels. If I want to hold a level of stock that I've only got a 4% chance of running out of stock, the point forecast doesn't tell me that. It simply tells me that it thinks the most probable level of demand is 240 units. Prediction intervals do give some indication of the level of uncertainty. The wider the interval, the more uncertain we are. But in practice, they're usually too narrow. For example, 95% prediction intervals tend to include or capture the outcome far less than 95% of the time. This is because of unforeseen circumstances. The problem is, when they are very wide, managers tend to disregard them. If you tell a manager that there's a 90% probability that demand will be between 100 and 5,000 units, they won't want to know. They'll say, well, that tells me nothing. So often when our prediction intervals are honest and wide, reflecting genuine uncertainty, managers are unlikely to use them. In one famous study, people preferred a narrow interval that didn't include the true value to a wide one that did. We don't like uncertainty. We don't like wide intervals, even when they're telling us the truth about the level of uncertainty we face. Currently, most commercial software products don't display density forecasts, that full probability distribution that we saw, despite their potential usefulness. So mainly in commercial software, you can only get point forecasts or prediction intervals. What are the advantages of using dedicated forecasting software, therefore? Well, the most common forecasting software that people use for forecasting is Microsoft Excel. It's not a dedicated forecasting package, of course. In one study, albeit 17 years ago, but I think things probably haven't changed since then, 48% of forecasters use spreadsheets. Only 11% use dedicated forecasting software. That's in a study by Sanders and Manrot in 2003. But using spreadsheets can lead to all sorts of problems, despite the fact that it is the most common way of making forecasts. It can lead to idiosyncratic forecasting systems that no one else understands. I visited companies where somebody's got some strange formulae that they've invented in the spreadsheet, and they make the forecast that way. But if they were to leave the company, other people would have no idea what the rationale for those forecasting systems were. So that's one problem with using spreadsheets. The second problem is that it can lead to methods that lack a theoretical rationale. I might invent some formula for my own spreadsheet that I'm happy with, but there's maybe no theoretical rationale for it. Spreadsheets can also involve methods that haven't been tested on lots of data sets or compared with other methods. So again, if I've invented my own method of forecasting for my company, then that method won't have been tested widely. And there may be simpler methods or alternative methods that would actually be more accurate. Also, spreadsheets can involve using algorithms that contain errors. Bruce McCulloch in 2006 did a study of Microsoft Excel, and he found that it contained lots of errors. The algorithms very often gave wrong answers. For example, he tested the solver facility on Microsoft Excel to see if it could find the optimum parameter values for nonlinear least squares regression. So he tried to use the solver to find what the optimum values of the smoothing parameters were, the ones that minimize the least squares associated with the regression. And he found it was wrong 21 out of 27 occasions. So software, even widely used software like Micro Excel, can actually have algorithms that will give you the wrong results. And of course, anybody who uses a spreadsheet will know that there are dangers of cutting and pasting errors and of making mistakes in cell referencing, all of which can lead to your forecasts going awry. One study found that those using dedicated forecasting software achieved errors about 7% lower than those using spreadsheets. That again was the same study I mentioned before, Sanders and Manrod. So there seem to be advantages in using dedicated forecasting software over spreadsheets, despite the fact that most companies do tend to base their forecasts on their own spreadsheets. Continuing the theme of why use dedicated forecasting software. Well, ideally, they can provide a wide range of different methods, so they can compare the methods and work out which is going to be most accurate for your data. And they contain a wide range of accuracy measures and measures of bias, measures that tell you whether your forecasts are tending to be too high or too low. And they're designed to support tasks specific to demand forecasting, such as hierarchical forecasting, where you are forecasting sales at the individual shop level or at the regional level or at the national level, for example. And they can also help you to determine how much safety stock to hold to try and meet some given customer service level. Again, these are ideals. There are many software products that don't have these facilities, but mainstream products tend to have these advantages. And they also allow forecasting to be automated. This is important when you've got to make frequent forecasts for thousands of products. I remember hearing many years ago that the US Navy had to regularly forecast the demand for over 1 million different items, from the buttons of admirals' blazers to cruise missiles, etc., etc., etc. If you've got millions of forecasts to make or tens of thousands of forecasts to make on a weekly or monthly basis, you just haven't got time to spend looking at each individual data set. Good software will automate the whole process, allowing you to make thousands of forecasts all at once. And it should also highlight the forecasts that are going wrong, so that you can attend to those exceptional products where the automation isn't working well. Also, dedicated forecasting software can support collaboration between different departments and individuals. In too many companies, there are what are called islands of analysis, where people produce separate forecasts and don't share the information. So different departments all have their own forecasts, even individuals have their own forecasts. And they would benefit tremendously if they shared all the information and used a single forecasting method between them, or shared their different approaches to forecasting. So good software will support collaboration between different people within the organization. And good software also does allow you to make judgmental interventions when these are justified. People tend to make judgmental interventions too often, of course. In one study of one company, we found that 98% of forecasts were changed judgmentally after they'd been made by the software. But at least you need to make judgmental interventions on some special occasions, and good software allows you to intervene when there's a case for so doing. Why should we, in fact, use software-based forecasts rather than judgment? I said at the start that people unfamiliar with forecasting often rely on their judgment rather than using statistical methods. So what advantage does forecasting software offer over using your judgment to make forecasts? Well, one problem with judgment is we all tend to suffer from psychological biases when using our judgment to make forecasts. For example, people tend to see imaginary patterns in noise. Look at a graph which is purely random, and we'll stare at it for long enough, we'll start seeing patterns in that noise. And we'll extrapolate those imaginary patterns into the future. And of course, our forecasts will be wrong because random patterns don't repeat themselves, or very, very seldom repeat themselves. So we tend to see imaginary patterns in the ups and downs of a sales graph, when in fact, there are no patterns there. People also tend to underestimate trends. A lot of research shows that if sales are growing, there's an upward trend. People actually tend to underestimate those trends. The same applies to a downward trend. Imagine a sales graph coming down, people tend to underestimate the extent to which sales are falling. So we're not very good in using our judgment extrapolating trends. We tend to underestimate them. People tend to give undue weight to recent observations and events. If something happened yesterday, it's very salient. It's very much to the front of our thoughts. And we often give too much weight to recent information and events, rather than taking a longer term view. We suffer from recency bias. Statistical forecasts don't suffer from that problem. People also tend to give undue weight to anecdotes or stories relative to statistics. If somebody has got a story telling us why they think sales are going to increase, and the statistics tells us that they're not going to increase, it's the anecdotes we tend to believe. Colourful anecdotes are much more attractive to us than dull, dry statistics. So if there's a conflict between a story being told by somebody about future sales and a statistical forecast, I'm afraid it's the anecdote that we'll tend to believe, despite it probably being very unreliable. And of course, people can suffer from optimism bias. I'm hoping that my sales will go up without future sales events. Of course, statistical bias suffer from optimism bias. Also, when we use judgment to make forecasts, we tend to suffer from motivational biases. Forecasts are often made for political reasons. I mentioned before, people often exaggerate future sales that they're going to make in their department, so their department will achieve or attract more funding from the central management. Lots of examples of forecasts being distorted for political reasons. There's also a phenomenon called herding, where you make your forecast the same as other people's. So if there's a large error, you won't be singled out. There's safety in numbers, there's safety in the herd. So I find out what other people are forecasting and I go along with their forecasts, despite the fact I suspect that they're going to be wrong. So I won't be the person hauled before the boss and accused of making a bad forecast. Opposite to that is contrarianism. That's deliberately making your forecast different to others. So you'll stand out if your forecasts are accurate. You'll say, well, I was the one person who got this right. Of course, your motivations here aren't trying to get accurate forecasts as much as deliberately trying to manipulate the forecasts so you obtain some sort of personal advantage from them. Okay, so that's about forecasting and why it's best to use forecasting software in most circumstances. Now, these are introductory chapters. So there's a little bit of omnibus of concepts I now want to cover. And one thing I want to talk about briefly is data cleansing. When we're using forecasting software, there's an old phrase, garbage in, garbage out. So we need to make sure that the data we're feeding into our software is accurate as possible and as meaningful as possible. And one particular thing that people may need to do is to make trading day adjustments so the software can make its forecasts efficiently. Now, monthly and weekly sales can be affected by the number of trading days. For example, weekends and holidays and different lengths of months can all contribute to variation in sales. So if all the shops are closed over Christmas, for example, you're not going to sell very much through those stores. Now, most good software products can adjust for this as long as you supply them with a calendar of information telling them when the weekends are and when holidays are and how long different months are. But we need to be careful if trading days are not equally important. For example, if both Monday and Tuesday are trading days, but Tuesday is usually a busier day than Monday, then the adjustment needs to take into account the number of Mondays and Tuesdays in a month when trading takes place. The book tells you how to make trading day adjustments. I won't go into the details of that now, but it's important to bear in mind that not every week and every month is the same, and therefore when you feed data to your forecasts, you need to take into account that all months and all weeks aren't equal. Okay, I want to talk briefly about the sort of patterns that you might find in your data and how the software uses these. Well, software-based forecasts are usually based on the assumption of constancy. That is, they assume that past systematic patterns or relationships will continue into the future. Because sales have been going up by 5 units a month for the last 2 years, we assume they'll go on increasing by 5 units a month, for example. So the patterns may relate to just the demand history, or they may relate to relationships between sales and other factors. For example, we may assume that there's a relationship between sales and advertising expenditure, or sales and the price we charge, and we assume that relationship will remain unchanged, that advertising will be just as effective in the future as it was in the past, and the effect of us changing the price will be the same in the future as it was in the past. So the key assumption is what we've observed in the past will continue into the future. What sort of components of sales history will software pick up? Well, here's a typical quarterly pattern of demand for a product. And here we can see that 3 components are likely to be picked up by the software. The first is the underlying long-term average movement in sales, represented by the dotted line. That's called the trend. We also see there's a regular 4-quarterly oscillation around that trend. We can see that quarter 4 is always the lowest, or almost always the lowest sales level within the course of a year, and sales always peak in quarter 3. This, of course, is a seasonal pattern, and most people who live in the northern hemisphere or southern hemisphere experience a seasonal pattern in their sales. If you live close to the equator, of course, there's probably less likely to be such a pattern. Finally, there is randomness. You can see here that quarter 1 there was the lowest period of sales for that year, but here we can see that quarter 4 was below quarter 1. In other words, it's not a perfectly regular seasonal pattern. This is caused by random things that occur in one year and not the other. Now, ideally, the algorithm should filter out randomness. The idea of forecasting software is to filter out those random, short-term, irregular movements and extrapolate only the systematic pattern into the future. And here are some examples of trend types that forecasting software should cope with. Here's a damped trend. Typical methods you might want to use here are the damped Holtz method, for example. So here, if we extrapolated a linear pattern, we'd soon be overestimating our future sales. Here's a linear pattern that changes. It's linear there, but the nature of the linearity changes. So methods, for example, such as Holtz method, which you'll be learning about later on in the series, can cope with that. Another trend type is the product life cycle, where products don't sell very much in their early stages, just after they've been launched, then gradually word of mouth operates and people learn about them, then they pass a peak. Perhaps everybody that's going to buy the product, almost everybody has bought it by then, and sales decline. Also, obsolescence can cause a product's demand to decline later in its life. And finally, there's an exponential trend where sales are getting faster and faster and faster in terms of their increase. So good forecasting software should be able to handle these patterns and extrapolate them into the future. They should also be able to identify what sort of seasonal pattern you've got. Here's an additive seasonal pattern. You can see the amplitude of the seasonal pattern remains constant despite the trend increasing. So the peak of the year tends to be roughly the same distance from the trend despite the trend increasing. And here's an example of a multiplicative pattern where the oscillations get bigger and bigger and bigger as the trend increases. So the distance of this peak from the underlying trend is much greater than the distance of the year 5 peak compared to the underlying trend. Again, good software should be able to detect whether the pattern is additive or multiplicative. But how should a software deal with noise or randomness? Well, the point forecasts created by software are estimates of what sales will be if there is no noise. Well, of course, there's bound to be noise in the future, but they are estimates of what the sales would be if there's no randomness associated with them. So they can be regarded as estimates of what would happen on average in the future if that future could be replayed many times over with different types of randomness. So you can imagine simulating the future year with different randomness, series of random numbers. And the average of all those simulations is what a point forecast is trying to estimate. So they're estimates of what would happen on average if the future was replayed many times over. So strangely, point forecasts are not designed to exactly predict an individual outcome. They're not designed to predict randomness, so almost certainly they're bound to have an error. This actually means you can never say that an individual forecast is wrong. It's trying to forecast the average of what would have happened over many, many different occurrences. For example, think of this analogy. I'm told that the average American male has a height of 69.3 inches. So the average American male, just over 69 inches in height. Imagine you coming to me and saying, well, I just met an American who's only 62 inches tall. Therefore, your estimate was wrong. Well, of course, my estimate was simply the average height. I wasn't trying to say anything about individual heights. It's the same with forecasting. We're trying to predict an average when we can't predict individual outcomes because they are equal to the average plus or minus noise. This means, I think, that the term forecasting error can be misleading. The term error seems to mean that the forecast is in some way wrong or inadequate. But good forecasts are bound to have errors because they're not forecasting the noise. I've come across senior managers who've been known to tell their forecasters off and say, why weren't your forecasts 100% accurate? Why don't you get exactly the future level of demand spot on each time? Well, of course, that's a nonsensical request. We can't do that, nor should we be expected to do that. However, we still need to take into account noise because we want to measure the variation in sales caused by noise. So if we're trying to estimate how much uncertainty is associated with our forecasts, or if we're trying to work out how much safety stock to hold, we need to measure how much noise there is. But the forecast itself, the point forecast itself, should not include noise. Another pattern that is, again, a fairly elementary concept if you're not new to forecasting, but worth covering, I think. Another phenomenon or type of pattern that you can discover in time series is autocorrelation. This is where there's a correlation between individual pairs of observations. For example, higher than average sales in one week may be associated with higher than average sales in the following week, or vice versa. You may get the opposite, where higher than average sales this week means that people have bought the product early, so you get lower than average sales the next week. Again, that would be a negative autocorrelation. So here you can see a typical sales graph with all the randomness involved and so on. And I've put this through some software, and it tells us that there's a correlation, autocorrelation of about 0.48 between successive observations. So between neighboring observations, they tend to be correlated. If one observation is above average in terms of its sales, then the observation that follows is likely to be above average. There's a 0.48 correlation between the pairs of observations. But what about observations 2 or 3 periods between them? Well, very little correlation there. If there's a 2-period gap between the pair of observations, there's very little correlation at all. These values on the graph below, the autocorrelation graph below, are probably caused by randomness. The only significant autocorrelation is between successive observations. You need software to find autocorrelation. Never trust your judgment to see if you can spot autocorrelation in time series. In a study by Reimers and Harvey in 2011, they gave people totally random series where there was no link or relationship between the observations at all. And people were very prone to seeing autocorrelation where there was none. So never trust your judgment to identify autocorrelation. Always put it through the software. Another pattern that software should take account of is intermittent demand. This is where the demand varies tremendously, and you get weeks where there's zero demand. So as you can see on the graph, in weeks 3, 4, 7, and 9, we didn't sell anything. But in week 5, our demand zoomed up to about 95 items. This often happens with the demand for spare parts, for example, where you have periods when you sell nothing, and then suddenly a few weeks later, you get a massive level of demand, and then that collapses again, as you can see, between weeks 5 and 6. So look out for intermittent demand. There are methods that you'll learn about later on in the series for dealing with that. And the most famous is Croston's method. And finally, I think, in terms of patterns in series, you often come across outliers. Here's an outlier in week 10. These are caused by exceptional events. Perhaps there's been a promotion of your product, or perhaps it's suddenly received some great publicity on television. Or sometimes data entry errors. People typed 1,000 rather than 100 when they entered the data. Of course, all of these can distort our forecasts. So should we get rid of outliers? Well, some software products have facilities for detecting outliers, and the sensitivity of the detection method can be adjusted. And the outlier can be replaced by a more typical value. So perhaps, for example, we might want to replace the 90 there by 35, so that the future forecasts aren't distorted by this exceptional event. But if you do have outliers in your data, be careful. Correcting the odd extreme outlier may improve your forecasts. Correcting too many, and you'll lose track of the amount of uncertainty in your data. So you shouldn't go over the top getting rid of lots of outliers. If there are lots of them, they're probably telling you something you need to take account of. Alternatively, if you have an outlier, you can use what's called an event index where the outlier occurs. For example, where special events like product promotions are repeated, you simply attach an event index so that the software can forecast its effect. Commonly, managers use judgmental adjustments to forecast special events, but again, these can be subject to biases. So allow your software to deal with outliers if it has that facility. Okay, another thing that your software is good at identifying is, or should be, is correlation. Here we see that our weekly sales in thousands of units are correlated with how many supermarkets are offering a discount. The more supermarkets that offer a discount, the higher our weekly sales are. Our correlation here is 0.84, which is, given that the maximum is +1, is a high level of correlation. This is useful in identifying factors driving our sales. It's always advisable, however, to produce a graph before using your software or during using your software, because it can easily be misled by correlation. Here's a graph showing the weekly sales revenue in thousands of dollars earned from a product and its price. So here we're selling it too cheaply, so we're not making much money. And then here we're selling it too expensively and nobody's buying it. So there's a non-linear pattern to our demand. Sorry, I'll go back there. But if you put that through your software, it'll tell you there's no correlation. It'll say -0.05, almost zero correlation there. That's because correlation in forecasting software is designed to detect linear patterns. It can't handle non-linearity. And beware also where you've got one exceptional point. If you look to the right here, we've got a graph of weekly sales of salt and bottles of beer sold per week in thousands. We wouldn't expect any correlation there, I don't think. But there's one exceptional data point where the weekly sales of salt were 80 kilograms. This is called an influential observation, and it's telling us there's quite a significant correlation between the two things. If you remove that observation, it will tell you that there's no correlation at all. So always draw a graph to check that one observation, perhaps a freak observation, perhaps a mistake in data entry, isn't distorting your calculation. Almost finally, you often come across missing values in sales data. Again, possibly a result of data entry errors. Well, how should you handle those? Well, you can replace the missing value with an estimate, perhaps the previous or subsequent sales, the average of previous and subsequent sales, many ways of handling that. But never replace a missing value with a 0 unless no sales are actually made. Otherwise, the forecast will be biased. And if you're calculating a correlation and you've got a missing value somewhere, get rid of the pair of data points associated with that missing value, and then calculate your correlation on the reduced data. Okay, so finally then, what are the broad conclusions? Well, forecasting software is more efficient than judgmental forecasters at extracting systematic patterns from noisy data and projecting these into the future. So they tend to be better than judgment at dealing with systematic patterns. Dedicated forecasting software, as we've seen, has advantages over the use of spreadsheets, so it should be used more. And no matter how sophisticated your software is, it's always wise to examine graphs of your data to avoid being misled by outliers, influential observations, and nonlinearity, as we've just seen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you very much, Paul.
I don't know if there is, I put one question myself, but if you have any question, please put it in the Slack channel. So there is a channel for technical questions related to this book. I put a question there myself, Paul. So it is about actually COVID-19. So you talk about different patterns in a time series we can have, and then you talk about outliers as well. And then we have seen COVID-19 change the pattern of many time series in many companies. So what would be the right way to deal with these changes? Or should we consider them as an outlier, or when we're modeling them in the forecasting?
Well, I think we certainly can't dump the data, saying this is an outlier, it's untypical, because I think COVID-19 is going to affect demand for quite some time. I think it's not an isolated, very short-term effect. I think it's a longer-term effect. I think that there are two ways that software can deal with that. A lot of methods, such as exponential smoothing, adapt to changes in the data. And you can change the sensitivity of those methods to new information by increasing some of the parameters, some of the smoothing constants. So possibly one way is to use existing past data, but to increase the parameters of the software so that it will very quickly update itself to the new circumstances. Of course, the other method is to dump all your past data, at least until the COVID crisis is over, and do your best with the small amounts of data that actually remain. But it is a classic challenge to that assumption of constancy, which is embodied in these methods, that we assume the future will be like the past. At the moment, the future that we're seeing is very, very unlike the past. So I think two ways: increase the sensitivity of your methods to detect new patterns, or basically dump your data. This, of course, is an area where judgment, I've been rather negative about the role of judgment in the talk, but where judgment possibly comes into its own more, given that past data is likely to be a very poor guide to the future here. So we should perhaps, in this sort of crisis, be more tolerant of forecasts made based on good judgment. And there are ways of improving judgment that you'll be seeing in a later talk, I think. Okay.
Oh, there is another question. From Shishwan, maybe exhibit 2D, I think it's one of your slides, exponential trend, is the early part of exhibit 2C, product cycle.
Yes.
Thus, how to decide the correct pattern of the deterministic trend if the decline stage of the product cycle is still not shown in the data?
Yes, well, for things like product life cycles, there are an established set of curves that tend to manifest. There's the Gompertz curve and the famous Bass curve, which actually produce forecasts based on that inverted U shape that we saw. Now, I published a paper some time ago with colleagues where we used past products that were very similar to the current product, analogies in other words, and we fitted models to the analogies and then assumed that the new product, which hasn't seen its full product life cycle, would behave the same way as the analogy. It's called forecasting by analogy. So, for example, we may have a new type of I don't know, calculator being launched with a few extra facilities. We could look in the past to see what the product life cycle for calculators has been, and impose that pattern on that of the new product. Now, it doesn't work perfectly. New product forecasting or product life cycle forecasting is notoriously difficult, but we found it was improved if you use the average curve for several analogies. There are more sophisticated ways of doing this. There's sort of methods based on Bayesian forecasting and so on, where you incorporate your judgment alongside the data that you have and so on. But I think forecasting by analogy, which I cover in the book actually, is perhaps the method I would recommend someone trying.
Great. There is a comment by Paul Bullard, not really a question, but it's nice to see and emphasize on not using judgment, as so many people seem to trust the gut rather than the numbers. Yes. Confidence building in any sort of forecast has been really important for me.
Yes, I think that's right. Judgment is extremely widely used. In fact, one can say in the end that all forecasts are based on judgment. Your choice of software, your choice of forecasting method, your choice of which data to use as a base for your forecast are all judgment calls. But the use of judgment directly to make the forecast is extremely common. I've done surveys with people like Robert Fields and so on this, and it is very widely used. And even when people use software, they cannot resist tinkering around with those forecasts, making changes to those forecasts. And very often these judgmental changes actually make an accurate forecast inaccurate. But people always think the future will be different. Okay, I got last week's forecast wrong, I'm going to be better next time. and we have, I think, an illusory sense of confidence about the ability of our judgment in making forecasts.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Paul. This was really fantastic. So now we have, I think, finished chapter 1 and 2. So next week, you're going to present chapter 3 of this book. Just to let you know that the slides and also the recorded video will be available shortly. I mean, the slides is already there, so you can check the GitHub link. The GitHub link is on the Slack channel. So if you go to announcement, you see there is a link to the GitHub, and then all information, including the link to the video and to the slides, are there. So looking forward to meeting you next week. And as I said, if you want to contribute and present in one of these weeks, just send me an email. Well, thank you very much, and I will end the recording now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.